All right, welcome to What is the Phenomenology of Spirit? I'm here with Mika, Eric, and Chetan. All four of us, I think, have read and related to the phenomenology of spirit in our own way. And I think what we want to achieve with this conversation is I think very simple and modest. And what I mean by simple and modest is just asking almost like a naive question. What is the phenomenology of spirit? It's, of course, it's a book. It's a very daunting book. And it's a very important book in the history of philosophy. And I think myself included, when first approaching the phenomenology of spirit, I think it comes with a certain emotional weight to it, in the sense that it can be very intimidating to approach it. The language Hegel's using is very complex. It's very dense. Even reading one page can be can be overwhelming, and you can lose yourself. And it's like, how do I approach this thing? So I think what we want to achieve in this conversation is just sort of an overview for people who might be coming to Hegel for the first time, thinking about approaching the phenomenology of spirit for the first time, and sort of giving them a sense of, what is this thing? Why is it important? And maybe a little bit about how each of us have related to this work, and maybe have used this work in our own careers. So I can start from my point of view. I think I want to start with my own process of becoming. So I started with an interest in science. I was always interested in human science, so to speak. I started my career at the intersection of biology and anthropology, and I was always interested in human evolution. And basically, in my speculative thinking, I basically took the worldview of human evolution as far as I think I could have in my career, in terms of trying to think about the human past, and then also speculating about the human future. But even in that situation, when I was sort of using the evolutionary worldview, and I think in that context, the evolutionary worldview is kind of like it's a dominant worldview in science today. So a lot of scientists are using this worldview. I was still left with enormous questions about myself, basically. So I had thought a lot about the human past and the human future, but was still left with a lot of questions about myself. And I think that this is a general problem I see among scientists today, is that a lot of them are sort of exhausting a certain scientific worldview, and still left with enormous questions about the I, still left with questions about consciousness, and where do I fit in this picture? And I think that that's where I sort of came to the phenomenology of spirit, or probably more accurately, where I came to thinkers who had been influenced by the phenomenology of spirit, and then sort of tracing their thought back to that book, and sort of recognizing, okay, this book is helping a lot of people sort of come to terms with their own, let's say, historical positionality of their I within the larger drama of life and existence. And since reading the phenomenology of spirit, I can sort of say, okay, there's a dialectical structure to the book that really starts with consciousness, and it unfolds through different stages or forms of spirit. Ultimately, we can go through them in turn, like self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, absolute knowing. And so it's basically like this dialectical unfolding of spirit, which is ultimately supposed to bring you to some sort of reflective stance of what Hegel, I suppose, would call absolute knowing, or the standpoint of philosophical knowing. And I think that has been, the more it sinks in, and the more I sort of reflect on this process of coming to be a knowing subject, the more it helps me to almost feel at ease with the complexity and chaos of my existence. I think that's how I'm relating to it right now. And before sort of passing it on, I can sort of say that how I've come to sort of see the book as a whole is not in any way antithetical to science, but actually a kind of a science of the notion, or a science of the concept, which is very paradoxical, because it includes self-relation. It includes a sort of a radical confrontation with the truth of the self, and that, as it turns out, that I think makes an enormous difference to how conventional science operates. So that's like sort of a little intro to how I relate to the book. But I'm excited to jump in with you guys, and also just sort of see where this goes.
Yeah, can I
Go for
continue
it.
from here?
Yeah.
I'm hearing an echo, but maybe that's all right. So thank you for inviting Anand to be discussing this topic. But man, you've all also put us to the task. I mean, it's such a daunting task to begin to tackle this work like head on. And it's a book that can be, even for a professional like academic, really a tough nut to crack. And I would imagine it's one of those books that's even if you are really a professional reader, you're going to find it hard to finish it. And also I would guess that it's one of those books that most people like to begin, but they just leave it midway because it's demanding. I mean, I've discussed with professors who like to remember their youth as a philosopher, as a student, that they had this circle of reading it, but they never got through it and everything. So it's a big piece to bite, but it's not impossible, since Hegel was the person who lived and breathed and fucked and ate and shat and everything. And so I would say that it's quite impossible to grasp the kind of like bare essential of the work, and maybe trying to aim for some kind of like bare essential in the whole work would be kind of pointless. But also not aiming at the essential would be perhaps foolish. So we have to be quite humble, as you said, presenting our views, and careful. And yeah, I'd like to maybe go on a little bit about what does the phenomenology of spirits from Hegel really mean to me, like personally. I cannot but think that it's sort of like a fate or some kind of a destiny. I just personally, I needed somebody to say things that I could recognize to be true. For me, it wasn't about who is this guy, and Jörg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel from somewhere. And I mean, I don't really buy into the things of basic premises of somebody like Kant or Schelling or Fichte, but with Hegel, I really can't find the place where I would really be at odds with his basic worldview. So I think I needed someone who I couldn't easily disagree with, someone whose thinking wasn't just a piecemeal thing that I could chew and then shit away. I mean, he stuck on pretty much. I mean, I just delved into the work, and after reading, I would say that since I've been reading academic philosophy and everything, I think that after reading it, I felt like there was this transformation in my own view. I started to view the whole philosophical scene with a different lens after that. I think that the work shows to me that some philosophical problems that we find today, they are really dead ends. There are solutions to some problems, are pseudo problems, and I sort of lost interest in some of the academic stuff that I was reading, and it was sort of like melancholic point in my life, and something like losing something that I actually didn't even have at the beginning. So that's what I would say about my own like personal involvement with the work currently. But Yeah.
I'll pick up from there and give my thoughts on the book and how it has affected me. I came to the phenomenology of spirit shortly after, I guess, what I would call a kind of philosophical awakening that happened after some significant changes in my life that prompted me to need to look more inward at the cause of my thoughts and desires and behavior. And Hegel was just one of those names that was kind of in the ether at the time. And so I picked up the book and determined to read it. And when I sat down to read it, obviously, like everyone else, it was nearly impossible. But in my experience and in my graduate work, PhD work, I've spent decades reading ancient texts in their original languages at a very, very close level, whether it was the Greek New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Ugaritic tablets, Aramaic papyri. And so what I decided to do was to take those skills and apply them to reading Hegel. So I determined to just sit down paragraph by paragraph and very slowly work through the text as if it were a scripture. I would read the text the same way that I would read, a book from the New Testament. And, and very carefully annotate, research. I would watch lectures on each paragraph from Gregory Sadler. And I did that for quite a while, for several months, just maybe one paragraph a night, two paragraphs a night. And I would write about each paragraph too. So I would try to digest everything I was reading such that I could actually put it into words myself. And what I found was that I would actually be able to read and understand the text, and it was magnificent. And what I found early on is that its formative effects were setting in very quickly. You don't have to get through the whole book to have it have a formative effect. I remember just reading the preface where he actually describes this point where subjectivity splits and the knowing I, as it were, donates a piece of its subjectivity to the concept. And the knowing I watches the concept sort of autonomously think itself through its movements. And I actually then observed myself doing that very thing, and it really shocked me. And I knew, okay, maybe there's something to this, when we actually are attentive to observing our own ways of thinking, you begin to see all of these movements that Hegel discussed, in real time. And that is precisely what this text is. In other words, what you are reading about, you are practicing. So there is what I'm trying to think of the word, homoiconicity. There's what you are reading, you're doing. And so as you read this, you are going through the same movements of conceptual thinking. And so what it actually does is it trains you, and this was Hegel's, his intent was to train the reader, to prepare the reader to be able to read philosophy, to be able to read what he would write later in the Science of Logic. And I think that is the whole point, the whole value of reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, is that it forms you. It forms your thinking. And that's exactly what it did for me. And one of the things that it does in particular, and we'll talk about the dialectic a bit later, but Hegel never gives you a leg to stand on. Once you think you've you've got a position, he undermines it and contradicts it. And you begin to learn how to do that in everyday life, whether it's politics or whatever's going on in the world, whatever you're thinking about conceptually, you learn to negate, to find the point where a concept undermines itself and contradicts itself. And so you start talking like Zizek. You start saying, "Well, isn't it the opposite?" Right? And that's exactly what what the effect of reading Hegel is. And I'll say while I was doing a very slow and close reading, obviously that would be a project that would take years to complete. And I knew I needed to get through the text at some point very quickly. And what I found is that after just several months of actually reading the text very slowly and carefully, and I did a fair amount of that in German, is that I could then later on just pick up the text in English and read it at a fairly normal pace. And I could get through 25, 30 pages a night maybe, and move through the text and get through it. So I want to encourage people who are out there who are daunted by this task, is that you can do it. But not only do you have to put in the work to do it, but you really have to think strategically about it. Think about how you read the text, and don't be afraid to slow down and take it bit by bit until you get the necessary vocabulary and Hegel's style, and you begin to get comfortable with it. But it is possible, and it is worth it. It is a life-changing experience, and I'll let Chetan pick up from there.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Carol, for having us here. Actually, it's a really nice discussion we are having. My engagement with Hegel actually started not that long ago. It maybe a year and a half back in that sense. I know I started reading Hegel alongside I started discovering Zizek, to be honest. But my engagement with, a lot of times in a true Hegelian fashion, we create our history from the context we are in that sense. And when you look back at your own philosophical sort of journey, you try and you end up discovering the roots of what you found in Hegel, much earlier than when you actually started reading it in that sense. My own background actually was I did my post-graduation in linguistics, and at that point of time, we were reading a lot of Chomsky in our department, primarily because the Chomsky teacher was very good in that sense, And for some one reason or the other, I found two things coming up with the discussion on syntax and Chomskyan thinking, which was that he was trying to apply the scientific methods to an object which itself didn't sustain a scientific inquiry in the modern sense, in that sense. The question of universal grammar as such is not an object like like Searle would put it, it is not an ontological objective object in that sense. It is an ontologically subjective question. And on the other hand, the interesting thing about Chomsky method was that it worked on language. They did give you results. And I was sort of struggling with this contradiction within that paradigm. And in that time, I discovered a philosophy, I started auditing courses of philosophy at IIT Delhi, a premier institution in India in that sense. And one of the first things that a philosophy professor told us, and which actually asked me to think post-Chomsky, and which was a very Hegelian thing in that sense. So his point to us was that philosophy actually doesn't engage with giving you new meaning about the world or new things about the world. It is actually, philosophy starts at the point of paradox, at the point when you cannot find something new to in that sense posit about the world. And it is in that context when I discovered Hegel, I found that come to us with full force. He Hegel in many ways completely inverts Aristotle, at least for me when I started reading it, and I then later on read that what is he doing in that in that sense. So he completely inverts Aristotle for me, where Aristotle tries and finds truth in non-contradiction. Hegel tries and finds the truth in the contradiction itself. And in many ways, dialectical method actually is a method through which you can do that. that which is why it's so difficult to pin it down to any fixed, and reading actually Hegel's book, Phenomenology of Spirit specifically, is an experience of sorts where at least 2 or 3 things which happened to me personally are, on one side, Hegel, as Eric rightly said, doesn't give you a leg to stand upon. He doesn't allow you to, he asks you to commit to a position also, and then he asks you to move away from it also. He doesn't give it to you from the starting itself that this position is a false one, or this position is this or that. He is asking you to, in many ways, be able to first accept a certain position and then detach from it, and then step back from it, then see its contradiction. And that process was very healing for me, at least. That process was not something where I'm reading a text and I already know with what orientation I have to read that that position in that manner. It allowed me to develop these ideas within myself rather than simply reading them in some philosophy books as a form of stratified histories that we read in that. The second thing it did was it allowed me to think about knowledge, and it allowed me to reconcile knowledge and experience, at least in my own. And I was an engineer before. I my own early readings were in science in that sense, and in many ways, this question of in what way the scientific knowledge reconcile with experience was always there with me. Hegel allowed me to show me a way in which these 2 things can be reconciled. That the cracks in your experience are the very conditions for truth, in some senses. And in what ways do we think through that kind of a, and it's not a simple leaving out of science. It's not an anti-science attitude. In fact, it is a way to ground science in your experience. If anybody tries to do that, I think he has to discover Hegel. There's no other way to, in our time, that there's no other way to think through that problem with any seriousness. And I think I'll just leave it there, and I think the discussion will move on and we'll discover things for ourselves.
Yeah. Thanks for that, all of you guys. Just picking up directly from where you left off there, Chetan. I want to say that in my personal reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit, I actually read the text itself before reading the preface to the text, and I did that sort of on the sort of the hint from the foreword in the Finley edition, that actually it's best to read it that way, or they advise to read it that way, because that's how Hegel wrote it, that he wrote the text and he wrote the preface at the end of it. And it was a very interesting experience reading it that way. And a lot is discovered sort of if you approach it that way. One of the things is that in the preface, Hegel explicitly gives the formula that what the book is really all about is against this formula of A equals A. It's basically this formula of non-contradictory identity, and understanding in that context, it's very simple that really Hegel's enemy in this book, it seems, is, I would say, this feeling of oneness, or this intuitive absolute, and that what he's trying to approach is ultimately a science of self-becoming, I feel. And he feels like the intuitive absolute, or the A equals A, is somehow a obfuscation or a way in which spirit hides from itself, or remains fearful to itself, or actually uses a comfortable truth to shield itself from the what he calls the unrest of life. That you can't get away from the what he calls the sheer unrest of life, and the fact that you, as a process of becoming, in order to discover your truth, will have to lose whatever it is you think your current identity is. And I think that is, to sort of bring this around to all of our personal reflections. I think that basic message, or that basic lesson, at least that I take away from it, is so helpful for living in the 21st century, because when you're, when you're alive in this century, it's almost like you are forced into the sheer unrest of life. You are forced into this accelerating pace of change where things are changing so quickly, and life is so unpredictable and uncertain, that if you sort of remain within a sort of static identity, and you don't have a tool with which to become, that being sort of the tool of seeing self-contradiction as a way to, I want to say, discover new depths of your own self-truth, then you can really get lost. And I think that in that sense, like that's how I sort of understand what you were saying, Chetan, about how Hegel reconciles knowledge and experience, that and that things are already reconciled in the crack. So like the tendency of A equals A is to sort of say, I don't want any crack, or I don't want any failure. And Hegel's basically saying that's the perfect way to get lost in a false truth, that the only way to find your truth is in the crack and in the failure. And that in some senses is a very paradoxical way to live. Most people don't live that way. So I think that and I think that one more thing I'll say on that notion is that I think that in doing this, I think Hegel really does work towards a science of consciousness, because in science, you have to engage in many experiments in which you sort of fail, but you aren't necessarily involved in the thing. The failure is external to you. Whereas in a science of consciousness, you are going to have to make repeated failures, and your very identity is the thing that's failing. So in that sense, you have to include yourself in the thing, and I think that is a very important lesson for contemporary science, because one of my dominant feelings since sort of becoming more familiar with Hegel is this feeling like that scientists are actually not on the level of, they're not on a proper standpoint of knowing, self-knowing, because they aren't really there. Like they for example, they know a lot about whatever they're trained in their specific field. But it's not a standpoint of self-knowing. And I think that is another major thing that Hegel wanted to leave us with in this book, is not just, okay, we're in the scientific age and now science is the spirit of the age. But he also said that our society, in some sense, has a sort of, don't know what the right word is. Science has a sort of, our society rather has a sort of responsibility to make sure that spirit is acculturated to the level of knowing, that it must sort of understand how it came to be what it is, or else spirit won't know how to use science properly, if that makes sense. So it's how I understand it before passing it on is just, this book sort of shows you the way in which spirit comes to know itself. And then from that standpoint, I think that I mean, a whole vista of possibilities open up that just aren't available without this sort of standpoint.
Yeah, I could pick it up from there, because I think you've touched on some very important things that make the phenomenology of spirit very relevant to today, because what Hegel is doing is what he calls science. Wissenschaft, which I guess we could just call it the business of knowing. And I think it's unfortunate that in our day that word science has been so restricted to the so-called hard sciences. And those sciences have become in themselves restricted to a kind of what Hegel would call a one-sided or dogmatic, non-speculative way of thinking. Although theoretical physics, I think, gets around that to some degree, and it is very much a philosophy. But there is, I think, a need in our world today for a restoration of science in this fuller sense of speculative thinking. And that is what Hegel is doing. And what he calls absolute knowing, or this identity of identity and difference, is ultimately what he calls science. And so, you know, you get to the end of the thing and you say, well, what's absolute knowing? Well, it's science. Well, okay, you know, it can be kind of a letdown if you don't understand really what he's trying to do is give us the tools, the mental cognitive tools to engage properly in science. And I think we desperately need this fuller expansion and restoration of this concept of the philosophical sciences. If we are to, as you mentioned, Cadell, to raise spirit to its proper place within our moment in history. And I think the phenomenology of spirit gives a good outline of how that actually happens or should happen. On that note, I would say I think that the phenomenology of spirit in particular is the site of, or the potential for, a great coming together, a great universality that I think we have not seen in philosophy or in intellectual history. You know, philosophy itself and so many different fields of science have split into their various factions. Theology has gone its way. We have continental philosophy and analytical philosophy, and we have mathematics and physics and all of these different factions that are antagonistic towards each other. And I think the phenomenology of spirit is one of the grounds in which people are rediscovering a certain universality, and we're getting people together from so many different fields and so many different, you know, whether it's, you know, analytical or continental philosophy or linguistics or psychoanalysis, and we're finding a commonality. And that is precisely because what the phenomenology of spirit teaches us to do is to do that hard work of negation, so that we cannot sit tightly in our camps and hurl insults at the other without doing that negation of our own self. And so we're able to reach out and find our place in the other. So the continental philosopher can find him or herself in the analytical philosopher, and vice versa, you know. And I think one of the things where Hegel really demonstrates this is in his section on religion, where he does not define religion as the way we would maybe define religion as Christianity or Islam or whatever, as this group of theological beliefs and clergy and such. But the way he defines religion is something that's almost inescapable. Like even the most ardent atheist and non-religious person still engages necessarily in a religious expression of spirit. And so what Hegel is able to do is provide at the level of what we call spirit here, something that is a universal experience. And so whether you are a Christian or a Buddhist or an atheist or a continental philosopher, a mathematician or whatever, you can find common ground in Hegel. And that can become the site, I think, of a great universality and a healing, I think is the word that Chetan used.
Yeah, excellent. If I can continue here. I heard Chetan say something very interesting, that the object is sort of like a self-procured object for consciousness in Hegel's phenomenology. And well, the standard type of like some type of universal recipe for reading him in phenomenology is to think of the kind of like opposition between the consciousness or the formation of consciousness with its own objects, and how this object shifts places with the formation, then undergoing some kind of transmutation after it. And I think that here we could perhaps delve more into the notion of experience in Hegel. He uses the word Erfahrung, which doesn't denote the type of immediate sense experience that I would right now have of the computer, of myself speaking, or so on. It denotes an ever enriching thing, something that's accumulates, something that enriches itself through its development. And here I think today we are living in somewhat, well the correct word is topsy-turvy world, as Zizek uses, but I think it's somewhat depressing times for somebody who's intellectually inclined today, since too much of, well, now I'm going into this whole beautiful soul line, but I see slander and stupid bickering going for an argument for too many times. So it's such a low grade and second quality products that are presented as like philosophical works. And it seems as though today we are in such a rush to just produce new papers, new discoveries, and whatnot. So that there isn't too much advancement in thoughts. Thoughts don't develop, and they're just left everywhere. There's holes where the writer has to just point that somewhere someone has solved this issue and so on. I mean, Hegel does something very different when he is writing about experience in the phenomenology of spirit. And also, I enjoy very much his way of being able to bring it always down to the most immediate, like the opening move of the work, the sinnliche Gewisses, like sensuous immediacy. And with the arguments from language, he then is able to show how we have to accept the kind of move towards perception, the kind of move towards understanding, the move towards self-understanding, and so on. So that's what I would like to highlight here in connection to the point about universality here also.
I would like to take a discussion back to the question of science that Gettle raised, actually. And this is something which has been very personal to me, because from a very young age, I wanted to be a physicist. And when you look back at that fascination with physics, when you had, when you were like 8th, 9th, 7th, 10th, those ages in that sense, the fascination was that you're doing science of science in some senses. That physics in some senses applies to everything, every other science in this world. Everything else, all knowledge in some senses can be broken down to principles of physics. And this question actually emerged with Newton in many ways. This paradigm of, and we do know that this kind of spreading of physics actually in many ways, how should I put it? It sort of impoverished the spirit of science itself. When Hegel would say it created some kind of unhappy consciousness. When you think that you can apply something that you're doing across the board, and Newton actually gave you that kind of a very strong system. And at that time, all the observations were so consistent with what he was saying that there was strong reason to believe that probably this can happen. And what is interesting is that the content of physics itself undermined it from within it, as it usually happens with the coming of quantum mechanics. That debate between Einstein and Niels Bohr, those debates become precisely interesting because physics undermines its own claim from within. But for whatever reasons, that claim became unhinged from its particular local practices, and it became spread over the whole scientific um, enterprise itself. That claim still exists in many ways, where you think that you can function within the broad scientific framework through this idea that science can simply be applied at a level of form without a content across the board. This issue of determinate negation in Hegel is very important. That in what way does content emerge, particular content emerge from a context in that sense. And I realized that very early when I was doing Chomsky, that dissatisfaction was very clear to me. That I'm not in many ways satisfied simply by knowing that this can be applied all over without actually working it out for yourself. And that question of science, and I just sort of say one more thing over there, and I'll and that question of science, it came to me much later, is a tolerable subject. When Hegel says, and which is I think the central thesis of the book, substance is subject. In what way do you elevate the substance to being a subject? It is the same process that actually we are going through in science. And if you look at what is the 21st century science today, 21st century science is not physics anymore. If you really ask that question seriously, it is biology. And if you look at biology, we have to even ask a very serious question: in what way biology is a science? We don't know anymore, because biology is a set of practices and techniques. And it is claiming to apply all over, even without giving you what Newtonian physics gave you, a certain consistent structure to do that. So today, the questions of genetics, questions of reproduction that are coming up with biology, which pandemic has brought that to the fore for us in many ways, actually is a very Hegelian moment. When Zizek says 20th century is the century of Hegel, it's a very, very Hegelian moment that we are living through. That what happens to a science when it completely reduces itself to the substance, when it completely reduces itself to its own experience of its practices and techniques without having any relationship to the object it's dealing with, the other in that sense. And in what way do we have to think through this problem? It's an open question, but I think it's a very Hegelian moment that we're living through in this question of science.
Thanks so much, Chetan. I definitely want to pick up from here, because I have so much I have so much emotional resonance with the idea that Hegel is not in any way anti-science, but actually bringing us to a proper spirit of science, and that it is actually possible to. There's a chapter in Less Than Nothing where Zizek asks, "Is it possible to be a Hegelian today?" And I think that he's asking in a very provocative way, but I think that in a very real sense, there are so many things going on in biology and quantum physics which seem to have a very Hegelian quality to them. And I think that the substance is subject is precisely where I would sort of see that transition taking place. In the history of science, I think, of course, Newton provided a certain form to science, and I think that in the spread of the deterministic worldview and the spread of the Newtonian worldview, what was lost was precisely the subject, and I think that all Hegel's trying to do is apply the scientific method or apply the scientific spirit to the self notion. And so include within scientific substance a place for a subject. And when you think about basic problems like wave particle duality, when you think about in quantum physics, where the observer has some sort of role in the constitution of the substance, very different from, for example, the problem that Galileo was wrestling with planets and the church, and a very paradoxical phenomenon when you compare it to the problem that Galileo was dealing with the church, with basically him saying the planets revolve around Jupiter, whether or not you're looking at them, whether or not you believe in it. It doesn't involve you as a subject. Whereas in quantum physics, I think we're dealing with the opposite phenomenon. And then in biology, I think as well, when we deal with concepts like autopoiesis. Concepts like autopoiesis are concepts that seem to have a far-reaching ground in biology, sort of as the self-referential behavior, self-referential phenomena, I should say. And that autopoietic behavior is seen as the almost the ground of a new life science, and many of the dimensions, many of the dynamics of autopoiesis seem to be very much at play when Hegel's describing the dynamics of the spirit and this process of self-making. So I think ultimately what I want to come to here is that oftentimes the form of the idea of science makes the mistake of thinking we don't have to worry anymore about the genesis or the coming to be of the content. And I think that the genesis or the coming to be of the content, the contingency of experience, is what Hegel's almost trying to include within the notion of science. And I want to say also that in doing this, even though in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he's articulating 6 stages, basically, again, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, religion, and absolute knowing, with absolute knowing being here the science of the notion. He also says that future humans or future man could take a different path to absolute knowing, that it doesn't necessarily, it's not a strictly determined path in that sense. There is a radical contingency in sensuous immediacy and experience, but that ultimately there is something absolute about the nature of absolute knowing. There is something about absolute knowing that no matter what contingent path spirit takes, it will find itself in this location, or will find itself in this standpoint, which I think I want to emphasize. I think Eric did a fantastic job of identifying, which is basically the identity of identity and difference. And the level to which this is such a simple notion, and at the same time it seems like so much metaphysical problems are coming up about identity and difference. I mean, I even, like, the more I think about it and the more I talk about it with some people, it seems like this problem of the absolutization of difference has become such an enormous problem, and as a sort of a reaction to Hegel, and sort of like there's this fear in Hegel that everything can be sublated back into the identity, and this is sort of like a tyrannical this is a tyrannical move. But at the same time, when you absolutize difference, it's kind of like you wind up with nothing. So you lose all process. That's at least my experience of it. But I'll leave it there for whoever wants to pick up.
Well, I want to pick up on a little bit on this discussion of science, and I would just make the proper attribution of that definition of absolute knowing to Todd McGowan, who does such a wonderful job in the content that he's produced on Hegel. But in science, particularly in theoretical physics, there is this motivation, this search for a theory of everything, the God equation, right? There's this single theory, the single particle, a single something that will solve all of the mysteries and bring everything together into a nice, clean equation or theory. And I think this is precisely the opposite of what Hegel is trying to lead us towards. Because what this is trying to define a closed universality. Lacan would call this actually phallic. So the search for this God equation or theory of everything is something very much within the masculine subjectivity, this phallic enjoyment. It's a closed universality, and what I think Hegel is trying to get us towards is something more of an open universality, a feminine, in the Lacanian sense, feminine subjectivity of a not all, an open universality that is able to admit difference. And that is the very difficult thing to do, because I think it does touch upon not simply the way that we go about cognizing these things, but it goes back to our own ways of enjoyment, and the way that we as subjects, and this is where I think we have to reach out to Freud and Lacan and others, to say that a part of that subjectivity is this logic of desire. And if we don't understand that when we are doing physics, then I think we've missed it. And I think Hegel is precisely the point where we begin to arrive at an understanding of that.
If I may, I might steer the discussion a little bit on another direction here. Maybe it relates to this issue of sciences and so on, since I would like to highlight the fact that I think that the kind of mainstay of Hegel's argument concerns modernity, I think, in the Phenomenology of Spirit. But the central task of the work is stated in terms of a theory of knowledge, epistemology. And we would expect then to find some kind of discussion of like justification, evidence, and so on. But instead, we find him progressing from the standpoint of consciousness. But ultimately, the kind of like well-known, I think, truism about Hegel's phenomenology is that it's a theory of knowledge which takes the concrete human history to be a significant factor in it. And it's a theory of knowledge that places various attitudes of consciousness. I mean, it's not just anything and so on. Attitudes towards objectivity, in particular, into some kind of successive and progressing form. And it is perhaps possible to read phenomenology then as some kind of long-winding and continuous argument in theory of knowledge. But this really makes it tough for us to discuss it today if we think of Hegel as doing some kind of standard epistemology. No, that's not the case. I mean, he's radically different, since for him, it really concerns our being as modern individuals, as lost in this like groundless world of who should we believe, who's got the authority, and so on. And modernity, I think, is the kind of time of individuality. It's a time of self-determination of us, and it's also a time of deepening sense of isolation and withdrawal. And I think that the kind of wager of Hegel is that we can only understand this situation if we have the proper philosophical seriousness, determination, and it is possible then. If we focus on the issue of modernity, we perhaps are able to somehow overcome some of the complexities of our life relations, and we can think of perhaps modernity in terms of the dispersal of avenues of life in general in our society and so on. I think it's kind of like characteristic of our modern life that life is fragmented here and there, torn apart in various directions. When, for example, your demands of family life can be radically at odds with your working life, and there is no pre-given order for anything of this, and there is no like ultimate authority to say how are you to govern your life, since modernity itself is about self-determining. And that's at the heart, I think, of the work itself, the idea of belonging to some kind of organic substantial whole. It's what modernity itself as a phenomenon shows to be false. I mean, tradition and lineage do not mean the same to us that they did to our elders. And in phenomenology, I think that the question of modernity becomes the question of how it is that we became the beings that we already are. And I would state here that the phenomenology itself presupposes spirit already at the beginning. And at the very first paragraphs of the chapter on spirit, he states that everything so far has only been an abstraction from spirit already, from the standpoint of spirit, because we are already in this dispersal of modernity. And yeah, we can also go about the direction that somebody would like here to, I think, supposing somebody would like to see us to say that the notion of spirit is controversial and what it means and so on. And ultimately what we are looking at in spirit is the standpoint of collectivity, of communality, of shared forms of knowledge. That's what I would say about it.
That was brilliant, Mika. And I think an important turn in the conversation, perhaps away from some of the also important discussions on Hegel and science, but towards sort of really situating Hegel in the political context. And I would maybe link just very quickly what you were saying back to, I think, Hegel's central idea in the preface, which is that he's really against this intuitive feeling of oneness and the intuitive feeling of the absolute, and much more leaves us with this feeling, like you're saying, of this the problem of modern spirit lost, not only modern spirit lost, but also modern spirit aware that it's lost. Like how you said it, there's this deepening sense of isolation and withdrawal. And even the weird thing at the end of the preface where he says that the individual must ultimately forget himself or herself. It's a very weird way he ends the preface, saying the individual ultimately has to forget themselves. But you know, the basic idea, like that spirit is fragmented, and that any sort of naive attempt to reclaim this fragmentation with an intuitive oneness is to sort of be avoided. And before passing it on, one of the things in the preface that actually sticks with me almost more powerfully than anything else, and there's so many things that stick with me in that chapter, but that he says that absolute cognition, or God or divine cognition, is not only the labor of the negative, but he says to be found in the triad of seriousness, suffering, and patience. And this is very different from a lot of ways in which mystical or intuitive consciousness understands divine cognition. I never find people who are focused on mystical or divine cognition to sort of link it closely to these categories of the labor of the negative, namely seriousness, suffering, and patience. But in my own sort of deepest alone with the alone moments, and even treating, like, you know, my religious consciousness as the alone with the alone, these three categories I just think are absolutely essential to reflect with and to be with. So I just wanted to maybe link.
Yeah. Well, there is this very interesting movement that Hegel makes at a number of points where he describes this great effort of consciousness to achieve something, but then there's a failure and consciousness retreats, withdraws back into this state of what he calls the unhappy consciousness. And he breaches this subject early on in the section on consciousness, but then it turns up again much later on in the book. I think it's in the latter part of Spirit, and because there's a similar movement where Spirit tries to accomplish something in the collective, and there's a failure of that. And so the individual consciousness retreats from Spirit, retreats from that, back into that state of the unhappy consciousness. And I think that's something that is probably a universal experience. I think we've all been at that stage where we have tried to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, tried to accomplish something at that level, and there's been a failure, and we've had to retreat back into ourselves. And what Hegel does is, I think, very ably describe that, and then ably describe what comes next. You know, how we get back, or what the effect of that is, what we've actually gained from that experience. You know, there's not just something negative about that failure, but something we take away from it that enables us to move to a higher plane of consciousness. And so I think, you know, there's something very practically relevant to that.
I'll sort of I'll take the question of modernity forward, and I'll sort of link it back to what we were discussing before, this question of physics and biology in some senses. Because I think it's important to look at what is the modern moment today. And it's not an easy question to ask, like Mika was asking in that sense, you know, in what ways do we think through modernity from where we stand today? Because, you know, as Hegel would say, history is written from the context that you are, you know, in that sense. And if we seek that transition from, I think, physics to biology, and what Eric was pointing out to us, that physics in that sense was masculine. You know, it was trying to give you, in some senses, the master signifier, the final authority upon all of the sciences. What happened in biology is interesting. Even that form which physics was trying to give was not needed in biology anymore. If you look at the debates on pandemic today, they're extremely instructive to tell us where we are. The debates sort of go in this direction that if we want to think about the ethics of doing research on viruses, and if you look at that discussion, how do you look at those ethics? And essentially what you are saying is that what China was doing, whether the pandemic happened with China or not, is a irrespective question. I'm just looking at the ideological spectrum around it in that sense. You know, what China was doing actually is the only way through which you can take biology forward. That is where there's a wide-scale acceptance of the fact that on one hand, we might not want to allow that kind of research in our own country, but that kind of research is necessary for any future protection from this kind of movement forward. In this sense, we are no longer even in the domain of patriarchy. You know, that's that point when we actually had a form to this master signifier in some senses. We were trying to give some structure to it. Even that is not there anymore. As G.W.F would very rightly points to us, you know, that patriarchy is not, or this masculinity in its direct form as it emerged in patriarchy is not the biggest evil today. In fact, it is something much more radical than that. You know, this collapse into techniques and practices that we see in biology actually gives us a sense of that simple emergence of the feminine as it looks. You know, in one hand, you can look at biology as very feminine. You know, there is particularity which cannot be universalized. If you look at the non-all of Lacan, you know, this particular which cannot be universalized, and so on and so forth. Biology would satisfy many of its conditions on first glance, at least, if you're not looking at it very seriously. And yet it can be much more violent. there is a serious threat of isolation over here, where even the earlier security, which we thought of as modernity 20, 30 years back, a security of the masculine patriarchal system is also not there. And I think this is where we need to actualize Hegel for ourselves in its true potentiality. The potentiality of Hegel is that it allows you to be completely free from that external patriarchal system. It allows you to give you a way to think about it, that you can't. It's not what you can function without it. It is much more radical claim that the only way to function about it is through this route now. And when Hegel sort of claims God is a subject, when he reaches there at that point, and if there is any ethics in Hegel, it is ethics of recognition in many senses. This question of in what ways can one individual recognize the other individual. I think if there's any way to move forward, it is of taking this Hegelian logic to its end. There is no going back to even those patriarchal forms which are making some stable ground for us to work through. Even those are being taken away in our times in a very direct sense. And something to think about. I'm not sure how you
let me jump in there, because when you take this ethics of recognition to the end in Hegel, to me it's sort of like an abyssal recognition that you take it to death. I mean, that's the form that you take it to, and that I think links to your point that not only are we no longer in the domain of a patriarchy, which can obviously save us with an eternal life, God the Father in heaven, but also there's really a radical form of violence that opens up. And I also just wanted to make a quick comment more on just the sort of reaffirming the brilliance of both what you and Eric have been mentioning about this transition from masculine logic to feminine logic, and how that kind of maps quite nicely, I think, in the transition from physics as the dominant science to biology as the dominant science. And specifically for those who are interested in actually undertaking the work of reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, I think that Hegel so clearly articulates this shift in his chapter on reason. If I don't know if any of you guys can recall the chapter on reason, where he makes the transition from, okay, rational spirit tries to formulate universal laws, and that these apply to the inorganic realm, but that these in no way apply to the organic realm because of the particularity and the autopoetic nature of the biology, and that all spirit can do is sort of recognize this tendency, habits or tendencies of organic matter. And he does say, interestingly, about the spirit of the earth, or the telos of the earth, that there's this telos towards oneness, but this oneness is absent. It's just this tendency. And really, we do have this as sort of I started and trying to connect to Chetan, this ethics of recognition, which is ultimately abyssal, which I think is important to, and that applies to a situation like coronavirus, right, where we're in a bit, we're led to these situations which are ultimately abyssal, where there's no other that can control and contain the potential violence.
What I take away from this, if I can say, is that what we really see, I think, in today's times, is that essentially there isn't too much new going on from Hegel's standpoint, except maybe he didn't understand capitalism enough, and we need some marks there. But essentially, we are seeing the same type of conflicts, the same debates, the same struggles that already puzzled Hegel in the Phenomenology, but only even more exacerbated today. And I think that the kind of problem of many conflicting claims towards knowledge should be thought of in terms of there might be religious or semi-religious or kind of crypto-religious cults who claim to have some kind of direct knowledge of God within their hearts. And this prevents them somehow from spiraling into negative doubts about God's existence, about what's the situation like. It gives them comfort and security and everything. And then there is the conflicting type from a secular person who claims to knowledge from purely standpoint of insight, of knowledge in reason, knowledge by methods, usefulness, so on. So the religious person can claim, for example, that the secular type is wrong when he is asserting knowledge about things where only the feeling heart, so to say, can rule over the things, since they are of that nature for the religious person, whereas the secular person would prefer certain shared methods of rationality and so on. So Hegelian question really comes at this juncture and concerns the question of, is there some type of norm or standard of knowledge in this connection of these differing worldviews? And thinking about, for example, the chapter on reason, it ends up with the sort of like an abrupt ending with Kantian ethics and the reason as formally self-consistent, as testing the law. Does it withstand to the law of the non-contradiction? And on the other hand, you have a person who might be sort of like proclaiming to have a knowledge, to have the law in there, right? Indeed, that, and he gives examples and so on. And Hegel's point about these two opposing views would be that they need to be really taken together to form some type of continuity with each other. And when we take one apart, then we have no means to understand either of them. And a movie comes to mind that it's so good at depicting this type of like semi-religious intuitive knowledge and the secular kind of a Lutheran type. You need to really see the movie My Dinner with Andre, which displays this type of like discussion about how should we operate in the world, what's the proper means, how should we know, thinking about the corona situation, who should we trust, what's the correct direction? Those are the questions here.
I want to pick up on that and some things that Chetan was talking about in terms of this, the notion of patriarchy and such. And I think to pick up on, Mika, what you've been talking about, especially in modernity and the reconciliation of sides, what Hegel does not like is what he calls dogmatic or one-sided thinking. And it's precisely this speculative philosophy of the dialectic that he exhibits in the Phenomenology that I think he thinks can do that very thing. That cannot be one-sided, but it can actually reconcile opposites, but in a particular way. And I think where he does this the best, and I think it's really almost the epicenter of the book, is where he's talking about phrenology, which is the practice of trying to determine people's spirit, their mind, their temperament and such by the shape of their skull bone. And he sees in this precisely this Kantian antinomy where reason comes up against a contradiction. And he says the being of spirit is a bone. And for Hegel, he sees this as this intractable contradiction that phrenology comes up against. But what he does here is he sees this as precisely the point where reason is able to actually do something remarkable, and that is to hold both of these at the same time. And so what we would want to do is maybe go to one side or the other. We would want to say, no, spirit is spirit. It's not. There's nothing material about it. That would be the an extreme idealism, right? There is no material. There's just the spirit. The other side is materialism, a strict materialism. There is no such thing as spirit at all. It's all material, right? And what Hegel does by maintaining this contradiction is he both materializes idealism and he spiritualizes materialism. And I think he shows us the way forward through that in his system, which is both an idealism and a materialism at the same time. And if we see today, I think our political spectrum divides precisely along these lines, where we have the left that is more materialist, and we have a right that is more idealist. And if we are one-sided in our thinking on either, then we're going to miss something that is actually at the level of spirit. And the way forward for us through modernity, I think, is not to retreat to one of those sides, to be, I'm a strict materialist, or I'm an idealist, but to find the point where both of those sides meet their contradiction and need each other in order to go forward.
Just sort of budging in here, I wanted to respond to actually Mika's, and I have a slightly different reading of Hegel in that sense. I disagree with Mika in that sense that nothing post Hegel has happened. I personally do not read Hegel like that. In fact, to be honest, if we really ask our questions seriously, can Hegel think through this transition from physics to biology? Hegel can think through violence of the physics. That is clearly there in Hegel in that sense. If you look at the debate between Stoicism and speculative thinking, the unhappy consciousness section, you can very clearly see this violence of the physics being there. Can Hegel think violence of biology in that sense? In what way can a science become this violent, much more violent than physics could ever claim to be, and yet it doesn't have this same form? I think Hegel cannot think a lot of things. I think when we read Phenomenology of Spirit, I'm very modest about it in that sense that Hegel can't think a lot of things that are happening today. You can think about radical repetition. You can think about drives, the whole Freudian Lacan moment, heterogeneity, as we all know, and maybe things like entropy, order. You can find a lot of such things. What is important, at least to me in Hegel, is that all of these things in some ways remain or becomes visible to us through Hegel only. A lot of the questions that we are asking today could only be asked once we go through Hegel. So at least when I read Hegel, for me, the idea is not that Hegel will open up everything that I'm doing today, but instead a much more modest and a much more simpler claim in that sense, which is, in what way does everything that I'm reading today actually has gone through this sieve, this Hegelian in Hindi we call it the channi. I don't know. In English you call it the sieve, but I don't know if you use it in your house or not. Things that you put through water in and the water flows down, and Hegel becomes that sieve through which you have to go through to actually even ask these questions. These questions become visible to you, which maybe Hegel could not think himself, and it's not important that Hegel should have thought of that. It was something that Hegel came first to a land from which all our journeys become possible in that sense. It's almost like there's a path to some place, and Hegel reached there first, maybe accidentally so. But if you have to go through that place for every day now, you have to pass through that path where Hegel put his, step upon. It is in that sense that I think through the Hegelian moment for myself in that sense. I don't know. How would you all, think about it?
Yeah, if I may qualify my point a little bit, yeah, you might have caught me pants down here, but wait a minute. I might say that, yeah, there are a lot of things that Hegel could not think of, and it's become a sort of like a hobby for some philosophers to do these lists, and I've read them and so. But I was saying that not much of crucial interest, I would say, has emerged in our shared field of public discussion of what's the key struggle in claims towards knowledge in these like a general theory of how to understand oneself in the world. In there, I don't see. I mean, I'm here underlining, I think, certain philosophical movements with this claim that they don't invent too many new points that Hegel could not already discuss in some way. And my approach here is to go and read Hegel more closely than the philosopher did in the previous century in these issues. But I'm sure that there are a lot of things emerging everywhere that Hegel could have no idea, but there's so much that he got. Yeah.
Could I say that perhaps what brings together, I mean, potentially what Chetan's saying and what you're saying, Mika, is this notion that Hegel actually functions as a sieve, and that by and that sort of like that one of the problems of 20th century philosophy is that they were trying to like overcome or negate Hegel, as opposed to like working through Hegel, like sort of honestly and thoroughly, and like being to really go through the process of understanding what negation means and what including oneself and one's project means, and in that sense also like as sort of like a, what I would say, like the Hegelian spirit, in the same way that the Newtonian or the Darwinian spirit moved through our society. That if the Hegelian spirit were to move through our society in the same way, that it would almost function as like a sort of sieve for individuals to sort of move through different standpoints of knowing almost before they come to approach modern topics in quantum physics and biology and other subjects. It's sort of almost like a, yeah, like I don't know, I've come to think of it almost like there are many scientists or even other fields where it's almost like giving a child a gun, like before they they like, should you really be using that weapon? Like, do you really understand yourself well enough to use that weapon? that type of thing. I'm not that's sort of one of my sort of notions there.
It is interesting to think about this in terms of the history of philosophy after Hegel and up through our present day, because I think after Hegel died, there was this knee-jerk reaction, because Hegel was so popular, and he was, I mean, he held the chair of Berlin for so many years, and there was this almost resentment in the air for so many people. Schelling and Schopenhauer and whatnot. And the Hegelian school itself split and was divided against itself. And so the Hegelian project really just kind of died. And it was taken over by, Nietzsche and then the rise of phenomenology and French critical theory. And I think there was
what about Marxism?
Well, yeah, and Marxism, yeah, and there was which is in its own kind of failed Hegelianism in a way, a divergent Hegelianism. And there was an abortive attempt at, or kind of a resurrection of Hegel through Alexander Kojev, and we see the effects of that in Lacan and so many others. But I think we've had to go through so many movements of spirit in order to recover a Hegelianism for today. And I think we are in a position to see that happen. and people like Zizek and the Slovenian school have done such a wonderful job of giving new life to Hegel through different avenues, psychoanalysis and so on. But yeah, I think we are in a position today, I think, to recover Hegel and to apply Hegel that was probably not possible before.
There's a friend of mine who's doing his PhD from one of these universities in US, and he's sort of working with a professor who's Deleuzian scholar in that sense, and he constantly looks at Hegel as the threat in some sense. It's interesting, how in a classroom space, Hegel has become that pejorative word. Oh, you're a Hegelian. If the professor has to say that you're thinking wrong, so the reaction comes, you're a Hegelian. And when me and him have our chats once a month or sometimes, what the discussion that surprises me in this kind of very aggressive reaction against Hegel that is also emerging in our times, which you have to become very conscious of, especially in social science circles. And I think this aggressive reaction against Hegel actually is a symptom of the Hegelian movement we are in, more so than this positive affirmation of it. When somebody's, as it happens with Freud in the clinic, the mother in my the woman in my dream was not my mother, and it was the mother. It is in that very much in that spirit when I see this complete anti-Hegelian, and even people who have never read Hegel, actually in many instances, very instinctively, even if they will not even quote Hegel over there, instinctively have this this understanding that you have to go through him. And I keep on telling my friend that what your professor is actually telling you, and you should take it seriously. He's not saying something which you should ignore. You take it very seriously and go and read Hegel. Actually, this is the moment to read it, because when he's saying that, you don't know what that means. He says, "I've never read any of these things." He's coming from practice, going to a PhD, and he said, "I don't." He tells his professor, "I've never read Hegel in that sense." And I'm saying, this is the moment to read it. This is the point when you're getting that kind of a reaction for what you're saying. And it is in that spirit, I think, that we need to affirm the cracks that Hegel is bringing with himself. It is coming with a lot of force. Whether you're Deleuzian, whether you're Foucauldian, whether my own sort of initial research was in Foucault, biopolitics in that sense. And Foucault has written against Hegel, but very interestingly, one of these places he said the only philosopher I read seriously was Hegel only. Foucault was a very close reader of Hegel. It turns out, so you have to go through him, even if you have to, find your footing on either side of that spectrum.
I want to talk about this negation. This I guess it's like a meta negation, because it's almost like the way I'm reading it more is like, you can tell who the real philosophical events were by the strength of the negation against them. Like, for example, and I think that there's really a misunderstanding, specifically among young philosophy students, that like if they read a book by Foucault and he's like somehow negating Hegel, it's like almost like, okay, we can take that as evidence that we don't need to read Hegel. It kind of like totally misses it. It's like you're saying, like Foucault was only able to take that position because he took Hegel seriously and was reading Hegel seriously. And like the same thing with Marx, right? Like Marx was able to somehow like turn Hegel on his head, but because he's reading Hegel closely, like there's something about, and that's, I think, like one of the interesting things about what Hegel was trying to do with the phenomenology of spirit was, he's basically saying, this book is not so that you identify with me forever. This book is so that you move through me and leave me behind, in some sense. Like it's almost like this is how you become a philosopher. And when you look at the greatest philosophers of the last 2 centuries, it seems to me like a great majority of them have become that through working through Hegel in one way or another.
Well, it's like as it's said of Lacan, is that when Lacan is being when he says he's being Hegelian, he's the least Hegelian, but when he's actually opposing Hegel, he's being the most Hegelian.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's where Hegel really should become a vanishing mediator. He should not be this towering figure that we jostle over, whether, I'm a Hegelian or anti-Hegelian, but he should become this vanishing mediator that enables us to move forward without him. I think that's fantastic. And we see this very phenomenon with the venom that is levied against Lacan from the mainstream psychoanalysis, and not to mention psychology. People who have never read Lacan know nothing about him, but they spew the hatred and venom for why? I don't know. Why? Because they know deep down somewhere that he will undermine their own position. And that's what Hegel obviously is going to do. Whatever position you take, even his own position is going to undermine it.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was pointing out earlier, that I think that this type of like bickering about stupid things and imposing some type of like arbitrary standards towards Hegel and everything, like, that like, I mean, who doesn't feel in their skin when they are pushed towards that type of like activity? There's something incredibly false about it. But really, what's working towards Hegel is it's the notion that Eric Ewert pointed out, the notion of immanence. It's what works towards Hegel's favor always. And this would make Hegel a troubling figure for somebody like Foucault, for example. But really, I think that if we think about phenomenology of spirit as proposing some type of genuine theory of a knowledge of what it is to know, then it might have to produce some kind of a criteria from its own developments, its own terms, from its own grounds, and a formation of experience that he would discuss, such as religious experience, would have its own terms, its own norms that it uses to evaluate knowledge. And when we are going through the academia, we find people who have a criteria of knowledge, which even without being able to explicate it, they have some kind of criteria. They evaluate persons such as Hegel and take them to be lacking without even asking the question, is Hegel subscribing for this? What does he say? What's are the formations of experience for Hegel? Why are they established the way they are? So the basic procedure, if we think about it, is that some figure of consciousness has an understanding of itself. It has a material ground, one could say. This is the Ansich, the in itself of what it is. And then it embarks on the journey, one could say, even of explicating what it is. What is this ground? And this type of split between the in itself and the being for oneself, that's the type of split that Hegel fully leaves open. It's the contingency which is turned necessity, one could even say, perhaps. But Hegelian truth, what is truth? The absolute. What it is not something that's imposed from the outside. It's not external limitation. It's not some type of like measure that would give us control over things. And there is this formulation from the introduction that, since he was dealing perhaps with Kant most of all in the Phenomenology of Spirit from time to time, and not throughout, but Kant is always the figure to keep in mind. I mean, you don't understand Hegel without going through Kant and Kant's transcendental idealism. And well, perhaps it would be a good time also to think about why Lacan thinks that Hegel is the most sublime hysteric. Maybe some kind of explanation would be in connection to what Hegel says in the introduction, that perhaps the fear of truth. I mean, sorry if that's a Freudian slip, but fear of error. I mean, what does Kant do, basically, if you boil him down to the basics? What Kant is doing, he's preparing the methods of knowing. He's preparing how should we know the thing, how should we approach reality, so on. And what Hegel sees Kant as doing is sort of like postponing the event of encountering the truth about the self-understanding of the situation forever. I mean, postponing, and just waiting for new discoveries to come and then supplant some kind of like, here is the truth, and so on. But why is Hegel then, if this is Kant, then this might be taken as some kind of like obsessional mode of being obsessionally just grounding things and postponing encounter, like the thing is too much to handle, it must be kept apart somewhere. And this is the mode that I most often see when I discuss with academic philosophers. I think they're mostly, as some of the most brilliant ones would admit, they are in their bones Kantians, usually. And what Hegel does, he doesn't add anything to this picture. He only shows that what if the kind of like eternal postponement of the encounter with the thing hides its own nothingness. And this sort of leaves the whole situation open. And then the question becomes, I mean, what if truth is not some kind of like thing lurking, like preparing itself for encountering in some romantic way? This type of like, he calls this even the ruse of, like, it would be a ruse if it would be that way.
I mean, for those listening that might need some sort of, I don't know, quick summary to I think the important points Mika is making here in regards to Kant and Hegel. How I understand what Mika is trying to express is basically the rational antinomies in Kant, where you can never really get the complete understanding of the truth, are basically turned into the thing in itself in Hegel, where like basically the very rational antinomies of the process are the thing. That's where the truth is located. So I think, just to echo what Mika is saying, Hegel doesn't add anything to Kant necessarily, but what he emphasizes, I think, so strongly, especially in the introduction of the Phenomenology of Spirit, is this emphasis on the fact that we have to understand our own cognition if we're to understand the truth, and that we can't really understand the truth without, radically including our own cognition within it.
Yeah, what I would like to add, and this is so important to point out also, is that what is the domain for itself for Hegel? It's language. And what you were saying, that it pertains to this point, that the language is the most truthful thing here. What we say, I mean, there's this constant trope that Hegel turns around and around in Phenomenology, is that he plays on the mine, the German mine, it's mine, and Meinung, meaning something, and meinen. So he plays around with this character who sort of has an internal idea of what he or she wants to say, but cannot do it. It's so tough. I mean, what I say, it doesn't reflect what I intended. What I intended was this, and so on. This type of like person is always there at Hegel's mind when he's being the most concrete, being the most actual. And the section that Eric brought up, the psychology section of the Phenomenology, it really deals with this phenomenon. How does the thing that we say sort of betray what we intended? Others take it apart, and it becomes external, and we no longer control what we said. I mean, I said something and it wasn't too clear, and then you had to explain. And it is this type of like constant opening process that Hegel has in his mind when he is doing. And what's really the most speculative genius in Hegel is that when he takes language as a medium, he transforms, I think, the way that we use philosophical language. And that's the obstacle that maybe the mainstream would like shy away from with Hegel. But I think Hegel reinvents language for the use of his philosophy to express something that I would call it sort of like a subject language, even one could say, language for expressing the absolute spirit.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize for those watching that something important I think just happened in the relation between Mika and I, where you see, and Eric pointed this out earlier, is that when you study the phenomenology of spirit, you start to be able to observe yourself more closely. Like Mika was saying, like, just the very thing Hegel was trying to just the very thing we're trying to describe just happened between Mika and I right now, where like Mika says something and then he loses and then someone else tears it apart, and then like you start to be able to catch these things in day-to-day life, and you start to be able to include yourself and your own language more radically in the logic of your own process of languaging in day-to-day life, and it's incredibly I don't know, it just fundamentally changes the way you are in conversation and the way you are with others, I found.
I want to circle back to what Mika was saying, and Cadell, you mentioned this term, the thing itself, die Sache selbst, that Hegel uses, which sometimes it's translated as the crux of the matter or the main issue or something like that. And it occurs at the very transition from individual reason as it spills over outside of itself into the collective spirit. And the way this happened, and Mika actually described it, is that there emerges in reason this thing, this subject, this thing, the thing itself, that becomes the main thing, the heart of the matter. And that becomes sort of the pivot point around which reason, in order to further deal with it, to cognize it, it has to spill out into the collective. It has to become a common possession of spirit itself. And I found, I think, a really good example of this, and I think it's really fascinating. And it involves the Lacanian notion of the short session, where in a psychoanalytic session, Lacan would often end the session very abruptly after 15, 20 minutes. And in order to punctuate something that the analysand would say. And what dawned on me, what was going on, and this came to me after watching this. There's a great film that is going to be coming out released soon called Adieu Lacan, which is a short a film that describes a woman's memoir of her analysis with Lacan. And in it, you see her go through session after session. And each time that she mentions something about her father, Lacan gets up out of his chair, ends the session, gets the payment, and it frustrates this woman to no end. But what it does is it punctuates this thing, the thing itself. It takes this insignificant signifier that the analysand just kind of throws out there, pardon me, and it turns it into the thing itself. So the short session is able to highlight and punctuate that in such a way that it becomes the thing itself. And when that happens, it becomes spiritual. And that is what essentially the Lacanian psychoanalysis is trying to do, is bring something out of the unconscious and spiritualize it such that it becomes the common property of spirit. And so we can understand psychoanalysis as being this very process that Hegel has outlined in the transition from reason into spirit. And so I think we can find a lot of these different examples in diverse applications where we can observe these very things happening. And if we can read the phenomenology of spirit and understand this process, I think it will give us an advantage in being able to identify precisely what we need to do in terms of the project of constructing our own world spirit and at our moment in history.
That's a very good point. Yeah. May I say something that occurred to me? I think it's quite. Maybe it would be interesting to think, since I think that many people would object to connecting Hegelian philosophy to psychoanalysis. Maybe it's good to keep in mind that in Hegel's time, the kind of psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, none of that existed. He had none of that available to him. It was just a different time without conceptualization of madness that's nowadays abound in every form of pop culture. Just think about how much people talk about depressions and all kinds of things so loosely today. But what he had was his pen and paper. So what should we say? How do we connect psychoanalysis then to what's Hegel's procedure in Phenomenology of Spirits? Well, ultimately it has to do with language and with history. I mean, it's a way of conceptualizing one's history, of putting into words what was left unsaid, the wish which persists in the unconscious, as Freud would say. And something that Zizek has pointed out is that it's not too far away to put hysteria and history, link them together, to historicize history, one could say. And Lacan even has a nice like neologism to capture this, the historia, a wordplay on hysteria and history. And the kind of like textbook Hegel that we have, they usually just say that Hegel gives this dialectical history and implants it into epistemology, and they just leave it there. Why not continue and say that, well, history actually doesn't really exist as such? I mean, as Lacan points out in his first seminar, history is really only the past as it is historicized in the present moment. And what Hegel goes through, the very stations, the points where spirit dwells, it has to make for some kind of problem that is grappling with. We could think of these as sort of like the type of fixation points in person's history, which are bound to emerge in a analytic procedure. That's something that came to my mind. Yeah.
Thanks, Mika.
Yeah, go for it, Chetan.
Yeah. You want to say something, Carol? Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead.
I just resonated with with the way Mika is trying to or like trying to link hysteria and history with this idea that, you know, history doesn't exist as such. That sort of come up with like these naive understandings of past and future. And that actually, like for Hegel, and like one of my interpretations of absolute knowing would be that the past and the future are kind of always existing from the standpoint of the present. And that you know, to really take a moment or to take a position of absolute knowing and is of course to, in some sense, leave Hegel behind, because you're constituting a past and a future and observing from your present standpoint. So I mean, you're observing things and you're dealing with knowledge and you're dealing with a situation that's radically different from the one Hegel was in. So, and I think that's the whole point of the sieve, as you said, Chetan.
Just to sort of bring back, I want to respond to this very interesting discussion between Kant and Hegel that Mika has brought up. And before that, you know, I would like to sort of, when I read these philosophers, especially when you read Hegel, you know, when we were discussing this earlier, that how do we read in that sense? And one of the things that I do not think that the task today is to make people Hegelian in that sense, to make people believe in what Hegel was saying. I think the task today actually is in many ways that in what ways do we make people realize that they have to engage with their own contradictions? Isn't it? I don't mind somebody being a Deleuzian, Foucauldian, Wittgenstein, any of these thinkers that you can think of possibly in this world, as long as you are ready to engage with the contradiction of what you are saying, whatever you're bringing. And proper philosophical moment today actually is this struggle between doubt and certainty. Now, as Alinka Zupanchik sort of very beautifully talks about it in one of her lectures in that sense, that how do we find certainty through this doubt of the contradiction? And minute you start doing that, you are entered into the dialectical space. Dialectics actually is that space in which this kind of a relationship in doubt and certainty becomes possible, in which we are ready to take a position. It's not it's a space, and as Eric was talking about it a little earlier, that you have to bring the contradictions together. Of course, you have to bring the contradictions together, but we have to take a position, and yet we have to be, in some senses, not be anxious about its own gap and moving forward from it. That's the real. It's not that you will not take any position. Okay, all of these negativities come together and it's all hunky-dory, great. No, it's not. There is a real challenge of taking a position in that, taking a decision in that moment. And frankly, Derrida got that in his many of his questions. When you think of Derrida's deconstruction is not simply this problem that world has no meaning. Everything is meaningless. The meaning is decentered, and so on and so forth. Derrida's problem is, even when meaning is decentered, how do you create meaning? How are you able to, as a subject, find that meaning in that sense? And that is, again, very Hegelian question emerges from, not this in that sense, but the Hegelian question that emerges from this actually is that how does a subject find this certainty even when he knows that he's sitting on contradictory ground and he has to take a position? And one way to take a position is that, okay, there is no contradiction, I cover that gap up, great, hunky-dory, I'm in the modern science world and techniques and this technicization of all sciences in some senses. And the other is, I'm always in doubt, I can't take a position, everything is right, there's no way to take a position, this is the truth, that truth exists. And both those things actually suffer from their own inner turmoil in that sense. And actually, this movement towards dialectics actually first happened in Kant. And this is where I'm sort of trying to take it. If you want to say something, Kettle, yeah. So
I just think it's so. I think it's so. I'm gonna and quickly pass it back to you. I just want to say that I think I totally agree with what you're saying, and just that this space, I think, is simultaneously the space of love, or is somehow overlapped with love somehow, like this, and that people today are struggling to take a position. People are struggling today to attach to something because of the gap involved in it, and that it'll turn into its opposite.
Totally. That struggle is very real for us, that we can only attach ourselves to something when we are completely, when we think that a certainty has to completely exclude all doubt. And that's the problem of cogito in some senses, Lacan's cogito, in that thinking of question, subject of the unconscious, if you think about it. But but this question actually first becomes very, very real to us in Kant, not in Hegel. If you look at Lesson Nothing's first few pages, you would find that if you look at Plato's idealism in that sense, the reality was always behind the appearance. There's appearance, and then they have to go behind it to reach the reality. In Kant, you came to that moment when you realize that appearance is you don't have to go behind the appearance. It is in the locus of the appearance itself that any question of reality resides, and that question. And in Hegel, this moment, which is why when I'm saying that when you read a philosopher, and more so Hegel than any other philosopher in that way, it is that you are not trying to go behind him. You are not trying to tell everybody that, okay, what you're saying is not true. There is something behind what you're doing which is true. That is not the purpose. The purpose is actually to engage with the contradiction of that appearance itself. of that moment itself. Only thing that Hegel does over, the only switch that Hegel makes, and that, as Kettle nicely put it, was that he puts that contradiction in the thing itself, rather than in the reason, as Kant would put it. Kant, that contradiction resides in reason, and in Hegel, that thing, it is in the very structure of reality itself. It's almost a incompleteness of reality. He's forcing Gödel and quantum mechanics in many ways to think through that kind of a question. But the real, actually, the challenge then, and for me, becomes to think through this question of doubt and certainty in Hegel. And from there, I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough in Hegel, which we should, and which Zizek is actually putting up front in today's times, is following contingency. That how do you think contingency in Hegel completely? Because Hegel is one of the people who are actually emphasizing upon contingency. We know that. Hegel is somebody who's contingency, I mean, something very specific, something which cannot be predicted or calculated in advance. Is there something radically contingent possible? First question should be that. In Newton's world, it is not. We know. If you know the ordinal variables, you can find all the answers. It's only in the post-Newtonian world that we can think of a moment which cannot be calculated in advance. And as Mika was pointing out to us, how do we think through history when we completely affirm contingency? Well, history is history because in many ways it excludes the contingent. How do we think through these things together? And that's an interesting discussion to think about through the Hegelian.
Yeah, if I may say, I think that you're treading on a very dangerous ground, since if you are affirming the type of contradiction as inherent to a position, I think it's quite dangerous if we then take Hegel to affirm contradiction in the way that almost like everything goes, like everything is just as like contradictory as everything else, the philosopher says. So this is not Hegel. I mean, he has the concept of determinate negation exactly for this purpose. And here I would like to propose kind of like my interpretation of, I mean, coming from the viewpoint where people are saying that Hegel is too abstract. People are actually saying that he is obscure and so on. But when you read Hegel, you don't find anyone who is as concrete as Hegel. Hegel doesn't say things that he cannot back up himself in his system. He always has some way of making it clear, of showing what he means. He doesn't leave things abstract. And it's just a mark of a lazy mind to say Hegel is, this is, I mean, I have no other way to say that it's enemy propaganda. You should turn off the computer and walk away right away when you hear the statements. Thank you.
Mika, yeah, you're getting me wrong. I'm not saying anything goes. In fact, I'm saying the right opposite to that. That's not the point. The point is that when anything is done, and if you look at phenomenal spirit, the structure is like that. He's taking the existing philosophical positions that exist, and he's not saying that I will start from a concrete full ground from which my theory works, and then I will engage from that stable ground with other theoretical systems. That is not Hegel. Hegel is saying that I can find my ground from any theoretical system by engaging with a gap within it. That's the concrete work that needs to be done, isn't it? That is how Hegel starts his book. If you read his book, it is actually engaging with almost all philosophical systems that existed before him. And he's not engaging with them simply as saying they are all wrong or they are all right. In fact, he's concretely doing the work required to find the gap within those systems. And a very informed discussion that actually happened on this question between Tupimamba and Zizek and Elinka Zupančić in one of these conferences that happened recently on psychoanalysis, actually. And I found Tupimamba's point very instructive, and I won't get into the whole discussion of sexuality that happened, but in a moment in which Tupimamba was trying to, as normally would happen with Hegel, something very Hegelian within Hegel, which Hegel could not think in some senses, which was this discussion on infinity, actually. That there was a moment in Hegel's writing on mathematics, and he was sort of quoting his early thesis of Hegel, and he was mentioning that Hegel was thinking that mathematics cannot think differential calculus in some senses. it can, infinity can only be grasped through um, philosophy. What is very instructive there is that, and he sort of points it out, that mathematics was actually able to think through it later on. Mathematics was actually able to move past the, it's there in his book also, this example. And this is nothing anti-Hegelian about it. If you take Hegel's logic seriously, it was bound to happen. If any system of science practices engages with its own contradiction, it will move past them. There is nothing surprising about it in that manner in today's time, and which is why we need to start thinking very seriously about not this any position goes. That's of course a problem, but in what ways do we have to engage with different positions? That question is still open, even when we are, the simplistic thinking cannot be that we have the truth and others don't have it. That dichotomy no longer works. That we are in some way repository of truth and others don't have it. We have to function with different truths around us to find the gap within them. And how do we think through that question?
On that point, Chetan, I was thinking earlier exactly that the point that you made about infinity is that this notion of absolute knowing, the identity of identity and difference, mathematics and set theory cannot conceive that, but category theory can. And it's like you can't just shut it out and say, oh, well, math can't do that. Well, yeah, it can, but you have to sublate that to the next level, and you just have to wait for the development of it through spirit, right? History, and eventually it'll get there. Yeah,
exactly. And that's something we need to be very conscious of today, that we don't operationalize Hegel as this standpoint through which we are judging all other forms of practices. That actually can become very unproductive in many senses. Hegel has to be operationalized from within different practices. That's the challenge. That's the challenge that Ubiyamba is throwing to us in some senses, which I find very, very important today, and especially in the context he's throwing it in context of sexuality. That he's trying to question this binary that has emerged: sexuality with difference, and sexuality without the gap in some senses that we have. He's saying that sexuality always comes with its own antagonisms in all its appearance. The challenge is to struggle with that appearance in some senses. And I think if one thing Hegel teaches us in Phenomenology of Spirit is that whatever is underneath will come on the surface. There is this progression always, in some senses, taking place in all systems around us.
And what is on the surface? What is on the surface will be internalized. What you experience at the level of spirit, there is a withdrawal and a reflection. Absolutely. Back into self-consciousness, which is really what absolute knowing is.
It will always face its own failure in that
sense.
Yeah, I just think in regards to this conversation about operationalizing Hegel within different practices through sort of the use of the contradiction. And also sort of and against this idea that it's not just, okay, when we talk about Hegel and the contradiction, it's not just anything goes. I think that what sort of makes it very practical and immediate for people, like without sort of them having to go through Hegel, is again this space of working with the contradiction and the gap has something to do with love. And so the very being, the very way in which one engages with the contradiction matters, and you can tell, you can tell if someone is trying to use the contradiction in your speech or the antinomies of your reason in a way to do violence to you. To hurt you, to harm you, that they don't really have your best interest at heart, and also to sort of think. I think Hegel is very the idea of absolute knowing, the identity of identity and difference, is so very practical to think about spaces of love. My love with my partner, or the contradictions I've been through with previous partners. It's not simply that anything goes, or that there's no progress. That might not be the right word, but that this is somehow deeply practical and deeply concrete. And I think I wanted to connect that also to what Mika was saying about Hegel, not really being this abstract, obscure thinker, but actually insanely concrete. And perhaps why people have such a strong reaction against him is because they'll be, I think, forced to face their own self-relating negativity, their own contradictions. So I don't know, what I want to sort of maybe expand on a little bit is that in my process of coming to understand phenomenology of spirit specifically, one of the things that I was sort of working through in my own spiritual consciousness was this sort of ideology of non-attachment. So like I sort of recognized that on the horizon of spirit, let's say, there was kind of like this tendency in the West towards Buddhism and non-attachment, that you shouldn't attach too close to things. And even there's this one line in a book I was reading before I started my PhD, which for some reason stuck with me, which is this idea that that non-attachment and love are equal to light. So like this idea that you can really love once you stop attaching to things and you let go of everything. But I think that what the dialectical process and what a sort of Hegelian phenomenology point to is actually that you can attach to things and you can take a strong position on things, and you can also let go as well. Or you can hold in such a way as that the thing becomes what it is in its truth. So it's you really surrender to a thing. Like that in attaching to something, you have to surrender to something authentically. And that in sort of attaching and surrendering to something, the thing will transform. The relation will transform, the person will transform. And whatever the truth of that transformation is, whatever the result of the process is, you can't know ahead of time. And I just think that way of understanding is so difficult to put into language. One, it's so difficult to put into language. It's almost an impossible task. I'm actually happy that I was able to bring up some of these points now, because they're things that I have wrestled with for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just that I think in Hegel you do have this, I guess, let's say, a dialectic between attachment and non-attachment, and that there is attachment in Hegel, but it's not an eternal attachment. It's you attach to see what the truth of the thing is, and you surrender to it, you let go to it. It's a radical submission.
It's kind of like a rhythm and an accent, as he says in the preface to the work. But really, I think that the kind of debate of I mean, it's not even a debate. When somebody claims that love is something ineffable, completely out of bounds of rational mind, something that you cannot express with words because words are limited and love is boundless, so on. These type of arguments, well, Hegel wouldn't trust headfirst into arguing with this person. I mean, saying that non-attachment is truth or anything like that. I think that the view would, for Hegel, be in the fact that they are already engaged in the modern project of trying to articulate their self-knowing, and in their account of self-knowing, they necessitate this type of reference to some ineffable something which always eludes, and they become sort of like I would say, some kind of a Teflon personality that doesn't stick to anything and can always sort of like easily overcome every opposition to their arguments with a claim to having an inner knowledge, inner sense of love within them. And this is the type of person who's really the account of self-knowledge that they have. Hegel does take it seriously. He really does explain what he sees as the most essential terms in this, but it all happens in language. It's always within language. And when we are saying that there is this kind of like internal purpose or love or whatever that cannot be expressed, language always did already express that. It's what it is. It belongs to the Wirklichkeit, to actuality, to that which works, which exists already when it is coming into focus of consciousness. And it's this type of like self-knowing reason, or self-knowing, self-actualizing and self-knowing, and this type of reason which is the figure of discussion in the formative chapters of the work, actually. But he has this nice formulation that its thinking becomes sort of like a musical tingling of jingling of bells and the smell of incense, and it sort of like loses itself into unhappiness as soon as it's like lets go of this musical thinking of it that it has. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Just to sort of take it back to love, I think there's something very, very important in what Kedel was saying. In fact, to me at least, love is the radical affirmation of contingency in many ways. If you think about it, the point of love, its peak is a point when you can radically accept the other in some sense, in all its contingent possibilities. When you're not asking the other to be predetermined by your own rules in some, and there's a lot of debate between how do we look at romantic love. At a certain point, even Lacan was, for a long time actually on this side of the fence, where he was not able to see the point of it. If you want to say it, and if you really take it to its end, the way that point emerged, at least to us, actually is in some senses will take us back to dialectics, which we can think about. It is that in romantic love, you have to, as Zizek sort of very nicely puts it, you have to completely radically affirm the contingency of the other. You're all happy, you're singing, dancing, you're living a good life, you come back home, you masturbate little, you sleep, you have good food, and suddenly you fall in love one day. And suddenly your life goes upside down. And you do not know who that will be, from which religion he'll belong to, which caste, which race, which, it can happen at any point of time, and then you have to learn to deal with it. And there is no guarantee that it will go in a certain direction, and a lot of movies, actually rom-coms especially, are built upon this ideology that it will be fine, go do it. But that they miss the point in that sense that love is actually affirmation of not knowing that it will be fine and yet being able to enter into it. You can't do it anything as a subject. You have to completely affirm that that space from which you can't direct that process from the outside anymore. In some senses, when you actually fall in love, I'm not sure if you have those heartbreaks and stuff, but if you actually fall in love, you can't direct that process from the outside. That is why there's so much anxiety. That is why there's so much need to control at so much time, and so on and so forth. And
I think
I
think it's interesting that Hegel equates the sphere of love in the family to this netherworld religion, or this law of the netherworld, where it's this kind of otherworldly law that sets itself in opposition to and it's feminine, it's this masculine phallic law of the state, right? And how it creates this conflict in spirit between these two opposing forces.
I think that's super important, Eric. And one of the things actually I had a brief conversation with Zizek about, which he seemed to appreciate in any case, is that actually Hegel doesn't spend enough time working through that aspect of the dialectic. He mentions it, it only takes up like one page where he's talking about that. And he very rarely often ever mentions sexual difference either. But indeed, like your point is, I think, incredibly important. Like he emphasizes the family and the law of the family as like, yeah, this netherworld. It's very, very interesting. I love that section. I think it can be more further developed, these ideas.
I just wanted to say one more thing, and Carol, to your point about attachment and this fear of attaching too much, actually is the same side of in the other side of this this problem of contingency in some senses, that in Western world, especially even in India in its modern context, the non-attachment has become anti-attachment in many senses. We have become, we take non-attachment to be this anxiety with attachment itself. This fear of attachment has become attached to when there is violence, there is non-violence and there is anti-violence. For example, non-violence is not this complete giving up of violence. No, non-violence is taking responsibility for your own violence in some sense, if you put it very crucially or crassly in that sense, isn't it? Non-violence is not simply a space from which you can say, I have nothing to do with violence. No, you have to take responsibility for it. If anything with Gandhi, you realize that. It is in that sense, non-attachment is also not a point of saying that I have nothing to do with attachment. It's a point when you take responsibility of the attachments that you are engaging with. But at what point has that non-attachment become anti-attachment? And that is the Hegelian dialectical moment over there.
I think the Hegelian point there, the movement there, would be precisely what we see in Star Wars with the Jedi.
Of course,
the Jedi have they're right. They're not allowed to be attached to anything, right? They're not allowed to have romantic attachments and so on. And so this very fear of attachment actually has this reflex where it creates this greater desire for attachment that ends up creating Darth Vader,
Yeah. And maybe we could also say something about what would be a proper like Hegelian act. What would be to truly be an actor in the world and not some kind of like, I mean, there's this popular meme going around in internet which I very much appreciate. It's combining the music from Oblivion, from the online role-playing game, to random encounters on streets, showing people acting in nonsensical and even absurd manner. And in massive multiplayer online games, you have these non-player characters, NPCs, which have certain music for them. And the meme is to connect these like random encounters with people on the street with this non-player character music and show the kind of like absurdity of our current situation in different forms. And it's a sort of like a state where there really isn't too much like activity really going on. I mean, they are really active. I mean, doing violent things and shouting and beating and everything, but there doesn't seem to be a true act going on. Like, but I think this comes from Zizek and so on. But the true act would be the symbolic act of forming one's self-conception in the way that structures the situation so that you become this non-player character who, say, gets really riled up at the street at some person who just happens to touch your car or something like that. And the character of Beautiful Soul, of like somebody who constantly feels oppressed at the street, I mean, has to take this radical withdrawal into oneself from the violence of the world, the corruption, and well, everything that I said already about modernity, it's there. But this type of personality who has this need to withdraw into themselves from the brutalities of the world. The act that they have done is to conceptualize themselves and their situation so that they have to do that. It has become sort of like mandatory for them. And the true act is just the symbolic like act of forming the space of knowledge for oneself.
Well, the act in Zizek, as far as I understand the theory of the act, is that you act in such a, it's a symbolic act in relation to the real, not the imaginary, and that you sort of retroactively change the conditions of possibility. Your act retroactively changes your conditions of possibility. Like the conditions of possibility didn't exist before your act. They were created by your very act itself. Like I mean, if I'm sort of taking that theory, if I'm understanding that theory properly, I think in some sense that's how I've tried to approach not only love, but also my relationship to academia in some sense. Is that like I've tried to act in such a way as that, like I didn't see the conditions of possibility within academia that I wanted to follow, and I sort of tried to act in such a way as that I create the conditions which I would like to see.
You know, if you think about it, taking this further, you know, as Jack would say, history is retroactively created in the same manner, as you rightly said it, you know, that we all create our history from the very contingency in that sense. That is the only way you bring these things together. History is never given to you from advance. It is something we retroactively create from a certain paradigm, a certain horizon. If you think about it, that is why each context has its own history. For instance, today we can write the history of the whole world or of the mankind through the class dynamics. But we can only do that post Marx. It's a retroactive creation of history. It's not that class existed before Marx. No, that's not the point. That's too simplistic in that sense that class was always there and, you know, we couldn't see it. That's one way to think about it. The other is you could only emerge in that, we could only think through the history of man through class because we retroactively could create it after Marx came on the scene. Isn't it? And to sort of take this further and connect it back to this question of love, I think Hegel's love is in this precise sense is not this love of the union of two people, this complete, very healthy union. It's a love, as Rilke would put it, I will stand guard for your solitude. I will not find this union with you, but I will stand guard to your own solitude. I will protect it. I will, and it is that love which actually completely affirms this retroactive creation of possibilities. Else, this complete union will destroy all possibilities, all potentialities of that space. You know, the challenge is how do we think through these possibilities in the retroactive, as you rightly said, this breaking away of linearity of time in some senses. You know.
Yeah. I like this, and almost also trying to connect this. So connecting love is not the union of two people necessarily, like a healthy normative union, but standing guard for your solitude. Also connecting that to
other solitude, you know, standing guard
the
for
other solitude. Yeah, the other solitude.
Yeah.
Connecting that also maybe to the topic of religion, like the idea that religion is not sort of like, yes, we do need to come together. Yes, we need community and we need communion and forms of communion, but also kind of like we need the social spaces that allow us to have our aloneness, that we're not sort of forced into situations where we feel sort of bound to some organic totality. To maybe connect this to Mika's points about Hegel writing at the birth of modernity, and sort of modernity being this sort of fragmentation away from some organic social harmony. That actually what we're dealing with in the modern world is sort of the cultivation of new forms of aloneness and also new forms of togetherness, but informed by that deeper sense of aloneness.
Well, I think on that remark, I think what Hegel shows in this book is that spirit at the level of the collective always fails and reflects back into the individual. And that's precisely how history moves forward, how spirit moves through failure, right? And so it's not that we are supposed to get completely alienated in the collective project, the religion, the politics, the nation, state, the whatever, but that we are going to do that to a degree, inevitably, but then that's going to fail and we're going to retreat back into our solitude. But from that, we're going to take something back from that experience. And then we're going to engage in that again. And so there's this kind of cycle, I think, of reaching out into spirit, advancing it forward to the point where it fails, and then retreating back, and then doing that again.
Nice. Very
No,
nice.
Yeah.
Erinnerung.
Erinnerung.
Yeah, Mika, please, sorry.
Yeah, Erinnerung would be the movement. Just
You know, if we,
Go ahead, Chetan.
yeah, I was just saying, just quickly pointing out that, if we take Eric's point very seriously, we have to, if we think where Hegel, at least in one of the places that Hegel locates religion, is this problem that there is something that alienates us from us itself. There is something which a certain kind of an alienation that takes place between two self-identical objects. One becomes two, and there's an alienation in that division itself that occurs, which cannot be thought through the immediacy of that which is why, if you think about religion in Hegel, there's a development of religion. There's a natural religion, there's a revealed religion, and there's a movement between religion of art, and then you get to and that whole movement actually is actually dependent upon this this question of in what ways does our own being becomes alienated from us. As Eric is pointing out, there's always, at the level of collective, there's always failure that something will experience, and the only movement possible actually is not through this immediate hiding of that union, or thinking that we have reached a point from which that alienation will never occur, but to always understand that at whatever point something will come to its own surface, it will get alienated from itself. In that sense, absolute knowledge is not the end of the story. In fact, it's just a specific point, an asymmetrical point in the journey itself. And how do we think through that?
There's actually a reading which is given by Frederick Jameson, which claims that, I think that he's not alone, but that really the narrative endpoint of the phenomenology comes already at the end of the chapter on spirits. And Schipazis makes this point that what we see in the religion chapters is really like materially existing practices of spirits. And the phenomenology of spirit itself, it has two major triads. It has the consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason as the first triad, which can be thought of as like a synchronic triad. They are present like simultaneously. And then there is the triad of spirit, religion, and absolute knowledge, which can be thought of as the kind of like diachronic triad of spirits, the historically developing spirits, one could say. And when the spirit chapter comes to the end, there is this enigmatic point where Hegel is thinking that the wound of the spirit, he's saying that the wound of the spirit will heal and it leaves no scars behind. It's this enigmatic statement that he just drops there, and what does it mean, and so on. But Zizek gives the reading that the wound of the spirit is in fact self-inflicted, and the term spirit itself doesn't stand for some kind of like thinking substance or anything like that, which would have the wound, but it stands for something completely non-substantial, in fact. And spirit is in itself nothing but, quoting Zizek, process of overcoming natural immediacy, or the cultivation of this immediacy of withdrawing into oneself, or the process of alienating from it, coming from absolute recoil. And Zizek is saying that spirit is subjectivity, the subject of the process, which is the absolute and immense power of negativity. And quoting Zizek again, the power of introducing a gap or cut into the given immediate substantial unity, the power of differentiating, of abstracting, of tearing apart and tearing as self-standing what is in reality part of organic unity, and so on.
That's really, yeah, I think there's so many gems in here for people who are listening, or who watch this later, or revisit it. I was in particular, I hadn't thought before of the way you divided up the phenomenology of spirit between two major triads, which is interesting to think. The triad of consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason, and then another triad of spirit, religion, and AK, and one being synchronic, the other being diachronic. These are really interesting ideas, and also both well, all of you, Eric, Chetan, and Mika, pointing out these relationships between the collective and the withdrawal. I don't know how many people are dealing with this in a very pragmatic way, but I know I have in the last two years, dealing with immense failure on the level of collective spirit, and dealing with withdrawal, and then sort of the counter movement of really using that self-relating negativity, really using the time of patience, what Hegel calls in the preface, time of patience, suffering, and I forget the third one. I wrote it down so I can mention it. See, yeah, seriousness, suffering, and patience, to really use that alone space as the labor of the notion, to then return to collective spiritual practice in a new way. So I really think this is great stuff. This has been a really great discussion, and I would just ask each of you if you would, if you have any final thoughts or concluding thoughts for this discussion, that let's open up the space for that. What is the phenomenology of spirit? Maybe if any of you have something that either you want to reflect on from the conversation, or what you would like to leave viewers with.
Well, personally, I would just like to say that I admire really the balls, what Hegel had to do the work of phenomenology of spirit. In fact, I mean, what kind of background he establish the work itself? I mean, as far as I know, he was desperately constructing some kind of system and philosophy, completing several drafts, I mean 4 or 5, and just tossing them aside as he found something wanting in them, and starting from scratch again. And at the time when he was becoming Hegel, he wasn't published I mean, he had some works going on, but he was basically in dire straits. He had no tenable job, no prospect of getting one either, and he had an illegitimate child on the way. And, well, Hegel's confidence and both also despair at the moment, they are really the key thing for me to admire in the work.
I think for me, the experience of reading the Phenomenology of Spirit has been so formative, and I think that line from the preface that's so eloquently translated in the Bai translation, that spirit wins to its truth only when it finds itself utterly torn asunder. that kind of becomes a motto for life, if I can dare to be so cliche. And that becomes something you can really internalize and make a part of your practical existence. that has real effects on how you relate to yourself, how you relate to others in your life, how you relate to the world. And the whole project and the formation that it provides the reader, I think, has been something I'll cherish, and I'll always want to come back to it and make it close to my heart, so that I don't stray from what it provides, because I've seen so clearly in my own life how transformative it can be. And I think it is something that is so desperately needed in our world right now. A world that is being torn apart, being torn asunder. Spirit is being torn asunder by its own very apparent contradictions. And so there's an opportunity in the darkness that we're living in now for spirit to win to its truth. And I just want to extend my hope and encouragement to all of our listeners, that you can do this. You can, if you're thinking about reading Hegel and you're daunted by it, or you're not sure if you can do it, it's possible, and it's worth it.
Very nicely put, actually, Eric and Mika. To me, actually, Hegel responds to a very deep problem within myself, actually, which I've been experiencing since long time, to be honest. I've been experiencing this strong realization that I'm living in a very fragmented world. Where the left hand doesn't know the right hand is doing. When I and more we are isolated into a world where movement is no longer possible. We can't think of movement in any real sense of experiential movement in that sense. Even if you wish to engage with two different systems of knowledge, there is strong resistance towards even doing. Forget those experiences that a child is supposed to have to become a man in some senses. Those initiatory experiences. But even something as simple as experiencing different systems of knowledge is resisted from the institutional mechanisms within in today's time. And Hegel actually gave me a way to think through movement in some senses. Think through a way in which I can affirm the space for movement in my life. And as Eric said it, that happens because you're ready to accept and take responsibility for the failure that exists in those movements itself. There is no movement possible without encountering that failure and taking, and working through that. And that movement is only possible, at least to me, when we take Hegel's position very seriously that the truth doesn't exist in immediacy. One has to find a way to move past that immediacy. There is a mediation existence in the very immediacy of a phenomenon that you encounter. And unless we take that very seriously, this question of mediation that exists in the very encountering something with a sense, with the very encounter with the infinite that exists within ourselves. And and this encounter always is determined with an excess, whether it is a excess of form over content or content over form. And the challenge that Hegel is giving us is that do not take that excess as an error, as something that needs to be discarded to be kept. That excess itself is a site of truth. It is itself where some work needs to be done. Itself where new content needs to be created. That excess is not something which is a waste, which is supposed to be thrown out, and and we can keep the so-called the nice food inside. What you're throwing out actually is the real thing in many senses. And at least that is what I experience when I read Hegel in some sense. And that is what experience I think everybody can share that position from whichever different life orientation that people are coming from. We all can engage with our own excess seriously in that sense. And
Great. So I think if I have any concluding thoughts. Yeah, I think I started by sort of saying that I had been immersed in the evolutionary worldview, and that took me so far in terms of thinking about the past and the future, but it left me with many questions about my own position within history, and I guess specifically, like, the most concrete things are related to, let's say, contradiction and love, and the movement of contradiction and love. So I think this conversation helped me to approach some of those things in a way maybe I haven't before, and I thank all of you for this conversation, because many things came up and allowed for fresh reflection on this text in a way that I hadn't before, and I think it's very valuable. I think it's just very valuable to have this space, because oftentimes when I was reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, it can also feel very isolating and alone, because not many people have really read it, or they might how do you engage with someone of a conversation about it. So in itself, it can be very, very isolating. So I mean, I guess the final thing I'll say to end on that point is that I have been motivated to start a course on the Phenomenology of Spirit, and I hope that can also provide a container for anyone out there who wants to tackle this text for the first time, or tackle it for a second time in a social space or community to join. There is a link in the description if you're interested in joining. The course will start January 15th, 2022, so just over a month away. And there's all the information you can find in that link, and to reach out and contact me if you have any questions about that process. So thank you, Mika. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Chetan. And thanks to all our viewers.
All right.
Thank you, Carol.
It was a trip.
Yeah.